My father was one of the few guys in that period who spoke good English, wrote good English, because he was a journalist and he ran a newspaper, so he could communicate well with the English. Looking at MA63, there was a kind of sense of optimism about getting out of colonialism amongst all the locals. And they were all working together. So he was kind of pushed forward as the representative. That's my understanding. He was originally against the MA63, but I think Lee Kuan Yew did a job. Lee Kuan Yew worked on him, saw him as a guy who would be the leading figures who could bring people together and bring them around. So I think Lee Kuan Yew convinced my father that Sarawak and Singapore joining with Malaya and forming a country would be a good thing. He resigned when Singapore left because he felt that as a betrayal by Lee Kuan Yew.
I had believed in Malaysian merger and the unity of these two territories. As a people connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship. Would you mind if we stop for a while?
I'm relating the story as told to me by Majid Khan. Majid Khan was my father's political secretary, Tan Sri Majid Khan now. Lee Kuan Yew had asked Tunku if my father had agreed, and Tunku had said, yes, my father had agreed. Then my father heard the news. Of course, Tunku had never asked my father about at least Singapore leaving. And then my father heard in Sabah and immediately flew to KL. Tried to see Tunku didn't want to see him. Went to the British ambassador at about 11 o'clock at night, knocked on the door, banged the door down, spoke to the British ambassador. The British ambassador, part of MA63, they were supposed to look after Sabah's interest. They sold out Sabah. They quietly agreed, done the deal. Frustrated, he's obviously snookered because Lee Kuan Yew had gone, tried to call Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew wouldn't pick up his phone. So he quit the next morning. That's the story from Majid Khan, which to me is perfectly plausible because it fits in with the fact that my father resigned the next morning. He went into opposition. That generation of politicians are largely forgotten, the people who fought for independence. There was a TikTok recently where they showed photographs of Tunku Abdul Rahman and people couldn't name him, and yet they could recognize all the members of Blackpink. So, I think that generation of politicians have forgotten. But if you talk about legacy amongst the Sabahans, I think it's remembered as a peaceful, more happy time when everyone was looking forward to a bright future. So whenever you mention my father, there's always like, if only he hadn't passed away, things would have been better. I think he wanted to make sure that the cultural heritage of Sabah was preserved. As he said, we do not want to replace one colonial master with another. So really wanted to make sure that Sabah would keep its multi-ethnic, multi-religious character. I think for Sabahans, for young Sabahans, it's important, and it's time for Sabah to claim back some of its power, right? And some of those underlying economic terms which were in that agreement. We'd become a poor state, and maybe it would behoove the young to pull out this agreement and make sure they understand their rights, so that their rights are protected inside Malaysia.